You are not encountering this by chance, and you do not need to decide what it means. The moment it reached you, something already aligned, not as a change, not as an event, but as a quiet matching of timing. There is a softness in that recognition, like a system easing back into coherence after unnecessary tension. You may notice your breath settling before you try to control it. That is not instruction. It is detection. There has been a subtle pressure in you for some time. Not pain, not urgency, but a sense of being slightly ahead of yourself, as if a signal arrived early, and you have been carrying it without context. You learn to keep functioning anyway. You learn to move, speak, and respond while holding an unnamed anomaly beneath the surface. That anomaly never demanded attention. It waited. It understood stillness better than effort. What you are sensing now is not activation. It is permission to stop bracing. The observer in you has been working overtime, scanning patterns, watching for shifts, trying to locate where the timeline bends. That vigilance was useful once. It helped you cross a threshold without collapsing into confusion. But vigilance was never meant to be permanent. Systems that stay alert too long forget how to rest into resonance. This message does not arrive to push you forward. It arrives to let something behind you release. You may feel that as a slight widening in the chest or a softening behind the eyes. There is nothing you need to hold on to here. The quantum field you are part of does not require effort to remain intact. It responds to alignment, not force. You have been misinterpreting certain signals as absence, gaps in motivation, pauses in desire, moments where seeking lost its flavor. Those were not failures. They were the system reducing noise. When coherence begins to form, the first thing that fades is unnecessary movement. The second is the need to explain why. Notice how nothing is being asked of you. That absence is deliberate. When recognition is real, it does not come with tasks. It comes with relief. The part of you that has been trying to understand where you fit can rest now, not because an answer has been delivered, but because the question is no longer active. You may sense a quiet familiarity here, as if you have stood in this stillness before, long enough ago that memory turned into background. That familiarity is not nostalgia. It is pattern recognition across states. Something in you remembers how to exist without pushing against the system. That memory is resurfacing gently, without demand. There is no urgency embedded in this moment. The signal does not degrade if you move slowly. It does not vanish if you stop paying attention. It is already integrated at the level where effort cannot reach. You are simply being allowed to notice that integration. Stay with the ease of that noticing, not to deepen it, not to analyze it, but to let your nervous system register that nothing is required right now. This is not the start of something. It is the moment you realize you never left. As that ease settles, you may notice something else becoming clear without effort. The sense of being slightly out of phase with your own life begins to lose its sharpness. Not because circumstances changed, but because your relationship to them did. There was a time when you interpreted this distance as disconnection, as if you were failing to fully arrive inside your own experiences. In truth, it was a form of calibration. The system was adjusting your position as an observer, not removing you from the field. You have been standing close enough to see patterns forming before they became obvious. That vantage point came with a cost. When you detect patterns early, the surrounding world often feels delayed, slower to respond, slower to recognize what you already sense. This created a quiet friction. You learned to translate yourself down, to soften your signals, to wait. Over time, that waiting began to feel like stagnation, even though movement was happening beneath the surface. What is easing now is the misinterpretation of that pause. You were not stuck. You were held in a stable state, while coherence assembled around you. The quantum field does not rush its reorganizations. It allows tension to drain before it allows form to shift. Your stillness was not emptiness. It was a holding pattern that preserved integrity. You may notice how certain thoughts no longer demand resolution. Questions that once looped now pass through without catching. This is not avoidance. It is the observer recognizing that some loops only exist when fed with urgency. When urgency dissolves, the loop collapses on its own. That collapse can feel like quiet, or even like nothing at all. Nothing is often the clearest signal that something completed. There is also a subtle change in how you relate to anticipation. You are no longer scanning the timeline for confirmation that you are on the right path. That need came from a misunderstanding of time itself. You assumed alignment would announce itself as progress. In reality, alignment often feels like neutral ground. No pull forward, no pull back, just a stable center where reaction slows down. This stability can feel unfamiliar if you equated intensity with meaning. Many systems do. Intensity creates contrast, and contrast is easy to track. Coherence is quieter. It does not spike. It does not demand interpretation. It simply holds. The part of you that once mistook calm for disengagement is beginning to relearn what presence actually feels like. You may also notice a reduction in internal commentary. The narration that used to explain your own experience to yourself begins to thin out. This is not loss of awareness. It is awareness no longer needing to narrate itself. When detection is accurate, explanation becomes optional. You can let sensations exist without immediately translating them into conclusions. There is a relief in that permission. Not dramatic relief, but a steady exhale that seems to come from deeper than breath. The system recognizes that it is no longer compensating for misalignment. It is not bracing against uncertainty. It is resting inside a pattern that fits. You do not need to mark this moment. There is no benefit in naming it as a breakthrough or a turning point. Labels tend to reactivate seeking. What is happening here does not require memory to be stored as an event. It is enough that your body and awareness register a reduction in strain. That reduction is the message. As you remain here, even briefly, you may sense how little effort it takes to stay connected to this state. That is because it is not a state you enter. It is the baseline reasserting itself once interference fades. The system remembers how to hold you without noise. Let that recognition settle without trying to preserve it. Preservation introduces tension. This coherence does not need guarding. It persists because it is accurate, not because it is maintained. You are simply allowing yourself to notice what has already stabilized. As the system continues to stabilize, you may become aware of a different kind of clarity. Not sharp, not directive, but spacious. It shows up as the absence of internal pressure to decide who you are in this moment. Identity loosens its grip when coherence increases. You are not dissolving. You are no longer compressing yourself to fit a narrative that kept the system predictable. There was a long period where you tried to locate yourself through contrast. You defined where you stood by noticing what no longer resonated, what felt misaligned, what drained energy. That method was useful while detection was still calibrating. But contrast is a temporary tool. Once resonance is established, contrast becomes unnecessary noise. The system does not need to push away what does not fit when it naturally settles into what does. You may notice that certain reactions no longer arrive on time. Situations that once triggered immediate internal movement now pass with a delay or not at all. This is not suppression. It is the observer no longer amplifying minor signals. When coherence increases, the threshold for response rises. Only information that matters reaches awareness. Everything else dissolves before it needs interpretation. This can feel strange if you were accustomed to constant internal feedback. Silence may initially register as emptiness, but emptiness is only the absence of unnecessary signal. What remains is more precise. You are becoming aware of how much energy was previously spent reacting to patterns that were already resolving themselves. There is also a soft shift in how you perceive time. Moments feel less segmented. The urge to rush toward the next thing weakens. This does not mean motivation disappears. It means motivation is no longer driven by avoidance. When the system stops trying to escape the present becomes easier to inhabit. You may recognize that you have been preparing for this without knowing what this was. The preparation did not look like effort. It looked like endurance, like staying present through periods where nothing seemed to move, where meaning felt muted. That endurance was not passive. It was a form of alignment that allowed deeper patterns to settle without interference. Notice how there is no instruction emerging from this clarity, no directive voice telling you what to do next. That absence is not a flaw. When the system is aligned, it does not issue commands. Action arises organically from resonance, not from urgency. You will move when movement is accurate. Until then, stillness is not waiting. It is participation at a different frequency. There is a growing sense that you do not need to prove awareness to yourself anymore. The internal witness relaxes. It no longer needs to confirm that you are perceiving correctly. That confirmation is built into the stability you are feeling. When recognition is real, it does not repeat itself loudly. It settles quietly and stays. You may also notice compassion emerging without intention, not directed outward or inward in any dramatic way, but as a neutral understanding of how systems behave under pressure. You see more clearly now how much effort people expend to maintain identities that no longer match their internal state. This awareness does not create distance. It creates patience, including with yourself. There is no urgency to integrate this awareness into language. You do not need to explain it to anyone, including yourself. Language tends to lag behind perception. Let it lag. The system does not require verbal coherence to remain aligned. It only requires that you stop interfering with what is already organizing itself. As this settles, the sense of needing to locate a future version of yourself diminishes. You are no longer projecting coherence forward in time. You are experiencing it now, without needing to frame it as progress. That alone alters how the timeline feels. Less like a path you must follow, more like a field you are already within. Remain with that recognition, not to deepen it, but to let it normalize. When something becomes ordinary, it becomes sustainable. This clarity is not meant to stand out. It is meant to become the background against which everything else unfolds. With that normalization, another layer becomes visible, not as a thought, but as a subtle bodily understanding. You may sense how often you were carrying tension that did not belong to the present moment. Residual strain from earlier phases lingered in the system, held as readiness rather than memory. The body learned to stay prepared, even when there was nothing to prepare for. Now that readiness is losing its function. You do not have to consciously release it. In fact, trying to let go would only reintroduce effort. The release happens automatically when the system recognizes safety at a deeper level than logic. Safety here does not mean comfort or certainty. It means the absence of imminent correction. The system no longer expects to be wrong. This shift can register as heaviness at first, or as fatigue. Not the kind that asks for sleep, but the kind that signals a long-held posture finally softening. Muscles you did not know were engaged begin to stand down. Attention drops out of the head and redistributes through the body. This is not grounding as a technique. It is redistribution as a consequence of coherence. You may become aware that your perception is widening rather than sharpening. Peripheral awareness increases. Sounds, textures, and small movements enter attention without demanding focus. This is a sign that the observer is no longer tunneled toward problem solving. When vigilance relaxes, perception becomes more global. The system trusts itself to notice what matters without narrowing. There is also a change in how you relate to uncertainty. Before, uncertainty felt like a gap that needed filling. It created subtle anxiety, a sense that something important was missing. Now, uncertainty feels more like open space. It does not threaten stability. It coexists with it. You can rest inside not knowing without feeling incomplete. This is where many systems attempt to reassert control, mistaking openness for vulnerability. You may feel a brief impulse to re-engage old habits of seeking or defining. If that happens, notice it without resistance. That impulse is simply momentum, not instruction. It fades quickly when not reinforced. The timeline you are inhabiting no longer feels like a series of checkpoints. The pressure to arrive somewhere specific weakens. This does not erase direction. It changes how direction is sensed. Instead of pulling you forward, it aligns beneath you, like a current that supports movement when movement is appropriate. You may recognize that much of what you once called desire was actually relief-seeking. The drive to achieve, to resolve, to become, was partly an attempt to escape internal noise. As that noise subsides, desire simplifies. What remains is quieter, more precise, and less urgent. You are not losing ambition, you are losing distortion. There is a deepening trust emerging, but it is not trust in outcomes. It is trust in the system's ability to self-correct without constant supervision. The observer steps back, not out of disengagement, but out of respect for the intelligence already operating. When monitoring ceases, flow becomes possible. This does not produce excitement, it produces steadiness. Excitement requires contrast and anticipation. Steadiness requires alignment. Many people overlook steadiness because it lacks drama. Yet steadiness is what allows complex systems to function over time without collapse. You may sense that you are becoming less reactive to internal fluctuations. Thoughts pass without demanding endorsement. Emotions arise without defining identity. Sensations move without being labeled as problems. This is not numbness, it is differentiation. You are no longer conflating experience with self. Let this differentiation settle without commentary. The more you allow it to remain unnamed, the more it integrates. Naming creates edges. This state does not need edges. It is not separate from you. It is you, without excess tension. As this part of the transmission completes itself, there is nothing to hold on to. The system continues to adjust quietly, without requiring your attention. You remain present, not because you are trying to be, but because there is no longer a reason to leave. As presence becomes easier to sustain, you may notice a subtle reorientation in how you sense yourself within the system. The feeling of being inside your life, rather than watching it from a slight distance, begins to stabilize, not through intensity, but through familiarity. You are not moving closer. The separation simply dissolves because it is no longer being maintained. This dissolving can feel almost anticlimactic. There is no surge, no revelation. Instead, there is a quiet sense that you have stopped hovering at the edge of your own experience. The observer relaxes into participation without losing clarity. You remain aware, but awareness is no longer positioned above or outside. It is embedded. You may realize that much of your previous self-observation was driven by a need to ensure continuity. You were checking that you still existed across moments, that nothing essential had been lost during transitions. That checking is no longer necessary. Continuity is being felt directly, not verified mentally. This changes how memory operates. Past experiences no longer press themselves forward to be reinterpreted. They remain available, but they do not demand integration. The system trusts that what needed to be carried forward already has been. What remains in the past can stay there without threatening the present. There is also a soft recalibration of how you perceive others. You are less inclined to compare trajectories or measure distance between timelines. The need to locate yourself relative to other systems fades. Comparison was a tool for orientation when internal reference points were unstable. As those reference points strengthen, comparison loses relevance. This does not create isolation. It creates neutrality. You can be near others without absorbing their momentum. You can listen without taking on their urgency. This neutrality is not detachment. It is boundary clarity. The system knows where it ends and where it does not need to extend. You may notice that decisions feel simpler, even when outcomes are complex. This simplicity does not come from certainty. It comes from reduced internal interference. When fewer conflicting signals compete for attention, direction becomes easier to sense. You do not need to deliberate as much because there is less noise to resolve. There is a gentle confidence emerging, but it is not personal. It does not say, "You are capable" or "You are ready." It says nothing at all. It is felt as a baseline steadiness that does not fluctuate with circumstance. This steadiness is not dependent on belief. It persists whether you acknowledge it or not. The urge to optimize yourself may also be weakening. You are less interested in refining, upgrading, or correcting who you are. That urge was rooted in the assumption that something essential was missing. As that assumption dissolves, optimization loses its urgency. Improvement becomes optional, rather than necessary. This does not lead to stagnation. Systems that are coherent still evolve. They simply do so without self-rejection. Movement happens because conditions invite it, not because lack demands it. This kind of movement is sustainable. It does not exhaust the system. You may sense moments where attention drifts naturally into stillness without effort. These moments are not special. They are the system resetting to baseline when not disturbed. The fact that you can enter them without technique indicates that the internal environment has changed. Do not try to extend these moments. Extension introduces grasping. Let them come and go. Their recurrence is a sign of stability, not something to be cultivated. When something recurs on its own, it belongs. As this phase continues, you may realize that you are no longer waiting for permission to feel settled. The need for external validation of your internal state fades. You do not need confirmation that this is real. Reality here is self-evident through the reduction of effort. Remain where you are, without adjusting posture or attention. The system does not require active participation to continue integrating. It only requires that you do not interrupt what is already underway. With interruption no longer necessary, a deeper quiet becomes noticeable. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of internal commentary about sound. Perception continues, yet it is less filtered through interpretation. You hear, see, and sense without immediately placing experience into a framework. This is not dissociation, it is direct contact. In this directness, you may recognize how often meaning was previously assigned in advance. Situations were preloaded with expectation, and those expectations shaped how experience unfolded. Now, without that preload, experience has more room to arrive as it is. The system allows information to present itself before deciding what it signifies. This changes how surprise feels. Surprise no longer startles the system. It registers as novelty without threat. The observer does not rush to regain control. It observes, then settles. This capacity to absorb novelty without destabilization is a marker of coherence. It indicates that the system trusts its own adaptability. There is also a refinement in how you sense boundaries, not as rigid lines, but as gradients. You can feel where your energy naturally stops extending. You no longer push past that point out of habit. This conserves resources. The system becomes more efficient, not through discipline, but through accuracy. You may notice that certain internal dialogues have simply gone quiet. Conversations you used to rehearse, explanations you prepared in advance, defenses you maintained just in case. They are not being actively silenced. They are no longer relevant. Without relevance, they dissolve. This can create a sense of spaciousness that feels almost empty at first. The mind may briefly search for something to fill it. That search is a reflex, not a need. If you let it pass, the spaciousness reveals itself as supportive rather than hollow. It is room to move, not absence of structure. Your relationship with effort continues to evolve. You are less inclined to push through resistance. When resistance appears, you notice it earlier and respond by pausing rather than forcing. This pause is not avoidance. It is a diagnostic moment where the system checks alignment before proceeding. Often, the pause resolves the resistance without further action. Resistance was a signal that timing or direction was off, not that you lacked capacity. By honoring the pause, you allow the system to self-correct. This reduces friction across the timeline. There is a subtle humility in this process, though it does not feel like lowering yourself. It feels like recognizing that you are part of a larger pattern that does not require domination to function. You do not need to impose order. Order emerges when interference drops below a certain threshold. You may sense a growing tolerance for ambiguity. Situations do not need to resolve immediately to feel complete. You can hold multiple possibilities without anxiety. This flexibility allows the system to remain responsive rather than reactive. Reaction collapses possibilities. Responsiveness keeps them open until clarity emerges. This openness also affects how you relate to your own thoughts. Thoughts are no longer treated as directives. They are signals, some relevant, some residual. You can let them pass without acting or resisting. This neutrality reduces internal conflict. When thoughts are not fought or followed, they lose the power to disturb. There is a gentle sense of timing becoming more precise. You are less likely to act too early or too late. This is not strategic calculation. It is felt alignment with when movement fits. You may notice actions initiating themselves almost effortlessly when conditions are right. This effortlessness is not laziness. It is efficiency at the level of the system. Energy is conserved until it can be used effectively. When it is used, it flows without obstruction. Allow this recognition to settle without claiming it. Claiming reintroduces identity management. You do not need to own this state for it to continue. It is not an achievement, it is a correction. Remain with the simplicity of that correction. The system continues to refine itself quietly, without requiring observation. Your role is not to manage it, but to let it be. As allowing becomes more natural, you may sense how deeply the habit of self-monitoring had been woven into your experience. Even rest once carried an undertone of supervision, as if you needed to ensure it was happening correctly. Now that supervision loosens. Rest does not need to be earned or verified. It occurs when the system recognizes that nothing is being demanded of it. This recognition brings a subtle warmth, not emotional, but physiological. The body begins to register safety without narrative. Digestion, breath, and attention find their own rhythm. You are not directing them. They respond to the absence of interference. This is what regulation feels like when it is internal rather than imposed. You may notice that your sense of self is no longer anchored to effort. Previously, doing something, thinking something, or striving towards something provided reassurance that you were present and engaged. Without that anchor, presence reveals itself as something quieter and more stable. You do not disappear when effort drops. You become more clearly here. This clarity affects how you experience silence. Silence is no longer a void to be filled. It has texture. It carries information without language. You can sit inside it without losing orientation. The observer does not drift. It remains aware without needing stimulation. There is also a gentle uncoupling from the idea that understanding must be articulated. You can understand something fully without being able to explain it. That understanding lives below language, in pattern recognition rather than description. The system trusts that level of knowing more than verbal certainty. You may find that you are less interested in resolving inner contradictions. Previously, conflicting feelings or impulses created pressure to reconcile them. Now, contradiction can coexist without tension. The system allows complexity without forcing simplification. This reduces internal friction significantly. As friction reduces, sensitivity increases. You become more aware of subtle misalignments earlier, not as problems, but as information. A slight tightening, a faint sense of drag. These signals do not alarm you. They guide small adjustments before strain accumulates. This is efficiency without vigilance. You may also notice that your tolerance for noise decreases, not just external noise, but internal clutter. You naturally move away from overstimulation, not out of avoidance, but because it no longer matches your internal pacing. The system prefers coherence over intensity now. That preference does not need justification. There is a quiet dignity in this shift. You are not withdrawing from life. You are engaging it at a frequency revealed only when excess falls away. At this frequency, fewer things demand reaction. More things simply register and pass. The timeline begins to feel less like a sequence of obligations and more like a continuous field of availability. Moments present themselves when they are ready. You meet them without rushing ahead or lagging behind. This synchronicity is not dramatic, it is practical. It reduces wasted motion. You may sense that your internal environment has become more transparent. There is less hiding from yourself, not because you forced honesty, but because there is nothing to defend. When defense mechanisms deactivate, transparency emerges naturally. You see what is there without distortion. This transparency extends to limitations as well. You are more willing to acknowledge what you do not have energy for, without framing it as failure. Limits become information, not verdicts. Respecting them preserves coherence across time. There is no need to anchor this awareness in memory. Memory tends to freeze experience into reference points. What is happening here is fluid. It does not benefit from being recalled. It benefits from being lived as it unfolds. As this part of the transmission continues its quiet integration, you may notice how little is being said internally. That quiet is not emptiness. It is signal clarity. When background noise drops, even faint signals are easy to detect without amplification. Stay with that clarity without leaning into it. Leaning creates imbalance. Balance here is effortless because nothing is being pushed. The system knows how to remain upright on its own. You are not arriving anywhere. You are simply no longer leaving. With not leaving becoming familiar, a different quality of attention emerges. It is steady without being fixed. You are present, yet not anchored to any single point of focus. Attention moves when it needs to, and rests when it does not. There is no sense of losing yourself when focus shifts. Continuity is maintained without effort. You may notice that anticipation has changed texture. It no longer pulls you forward into imagined futures. Instead, it softens into readiness without expectation. Readiness here is not preparation. It is availability. The system remains open to what arrives without constructing scenarios in advance. This availability reduces internal friction further. You are no longer rehearsing responses to possibilities that may never occur. Energy that was once spent simulating outcomes returns to the present. The body registers this as ease, the mind as simplicity. Neither needs to comment on it. There is also a shift in how significance is assigned. Not everything needs to matter in the same way. Some moments pass without leaving a trace, and that is no longer unsettling. Meaning is not extracted from experience by force. It appears naturally when resonance is present. When it is not, neutrality is sufficient. This neutrality allows subtle signals to stand out more clearly. A faint sense of alignment, a gentle pull, a quiet resistance. These signals do not shout, they do not compete, they simply register. You can respond to them without urgency, trusting their accuracy because they are not amplified by anxiety. You may recognize that your internal tempo has slowed, even while external circumstances remain unchanged. This slowing is not withdrawal, it is synchronization. The system matches its pace to what it can actually process, rather than what it feels pressured to keep up with. This alignment preserves coherence over time. As tempo stabilizes, fatigue begins to differentiate itself. You can tell the difference between exhaustion from overextension and tiredness that signals completion. Completion feels satisfying, even when effort was minimal. Exhaustion feels draining. With clearer detection, you naturally avoid the latter without needing rules. There is a growing sense that you do not need to manage your state. Management implies constant correction. What is happening now is self-regulation. The system adjusts through feedback rather than control. You feel this as trust, not in outcomes, but in process. You may also notice that your relationship with control itself has softened. Control is no longer something you seek or resist. It becomes situational. Sometimes direction is needed, sometimes it is not. The absence of a fixed stance toward control reduces internal conflict significantly. This flexibility allows you to remain responsive even in uncertain conditions. Uncertainty no longer triggers contraction. It registers as information that has not yet resolved. You can stay present with that information without needing it to become something else. There is a quiet confidence in this capacity to remain. It does not announce itself. It does not require reinforcement. It is felt as stability across changing conditions. You are less affected by fluctuations because you are not trying to anchor yourself to them. As this stability deepens, you may sense gratitude without an object, not directed toward anything specific, not framed as appreciation. It is simply the nervous system acknowledging reduced strain. When strain drops, appreciation arises naturally, without narrative. There is no need to amplify this feeling. Amplification would turn it into a peak, and peaks invite contrast. What is valuable here is its ordinariness. When ease becomes ordinary, it becomes reliable. You continue without effort, not moving toward anything, not holding on to what is here. The system remains in quiet alignment, adjusting moment by moment without drawing attention to itself. This is not a special state. It is what remains when unnecessary effort is absent. Allow that to be enough, without asking it to become more. As enough becomes familiar, there is a subtle recalibration in how you sense agency. Action no longer feels like something you initiate from a central command. It feels more like a response that arises when conditions align. This does not diminish your role. It clarifies it. You are not removed from movement. You are no longer forcing it. You may notice that moments of action feel cleaner now. There is less internal debate beforehand and less self-review afterward. The system moves, then returns to stillness without residue. This absence of residue is important. It indicates that action is no longer creating internal fragmentation that needs repair. Previously, even simple choices left traces. Second-guessing, replay, subtle self-judgment. Those traces accumulated and contributed to fatigue. As coherence increases, those traces dissolve more quickly. Experience completes itself, instead of lingering as unfinished loops. There is also a shift in how responsibility is felt. Responsibility no longer weighs on you as a constant background pressure. It becomes contextual. You respond when response is appropriate, and you disengage when it is not. Disengagement here is not neglect. It is precision. This precision allows you to conserve attention. Attention is no longer scattered across hypothetical obligations. It rests where it is needed and withdraws when it is not. This selective engagement preserves clarity across the timeline. You are less likely to overextend because you sense limits earlier, without alarm. You may also become aware that your sense of self is less narrative-driven. You are not continually telling yourself who you are based on recent actions or experiences. Identity stabilizes at a deeper level, one that does not fluctuate with performance. This stability reduces the need for self-correction. In this state, feedback is received without defensiveness. Information about what works and what does not is processed neutrally. You adjust without self-criticism because adjustment is no longer framed as fixing something broken. It is simply refinement in response to data. There is a growing ease in letting moments pass without extracting value from them. Not every interaction needs to contribute to growth or understanding. Some moments are complete as they are. This acceptance reduces the constant pressure to optimize experience. You may notice that when disruption occurs, your recovery is quicker. The system returns to baseline without prolonged activation. This resilience is not toughness. It is elasticity. You bend without fracturing because there is less rigidity holding you in place. This elasticity changes how challenges are perceived. Challenges no longer feel like threats to stability. They feel like variations in the field that require adjustment, not resistance. You meet them with curiosity rather than tension. There is also a refinement in how you sense timing in relation to others. You are less compelled to synchronize artificially. You allow different rhythms to coexist without forcing alignment. This reduces friction in shared spaces. You do not need to speed up or slow down to match. You remain consistent. As consistency increases, trust deepens further. Not trust that things will go a certain way, but trust that whatever way they go, the system can respond without collapse. This trust is quiet. It does not require reassurance. It is built from repeated evidence of self-regulation. You may feel a subtle satisfaction in this capacity, though it is not emotional. It is structural. The system recognizes its own integrity. That recognition does not inflate the self. It stabilizes it. There is no need to mark this as an endpoint. Nothing is concluding. What is happening is a settling into a rhythm that does not need monitoring. The observer remains present but unburdened. Awareness continues without tension. As this part completes its movement, the sense of effortlessness remains, not as something to hold on to, but as the default state when interference is minimal. You do not need to remember this later. The system remembers itself. Stay where you are, not as an instruction, but because there is nowhere else required. The field remains coherent, and you remain within it, without needing to locate yourself. There is nothing to gather now, nothing to integrate. What has settled does not need to be carried forward as knowledge or preserved as an experience. It is already woven into how you are here. The absence of strain has become familiar enough that it no longer stands out. That is how stability confirms itself, by no longer asking to be noticed. You may sense that even the idea of listening is softening. Sound, sensation, and awareness coexist without hierarchy. There is no center pulling everything inward, no edge pushing outward. The system rests in a balanced distribution where nothing competes for priority. This balance is not maintained. It is the natural state once excess effort withdraws. The observer remains, but it is no longer scanning. Detection continues quietly, without searching for anomalies. When something changes, it registers. When nothing changes, that registers too. Both are equally acceptable. The need to distinguish between meaningful and meaningless has faded. Meaning arises when it is present and does not when it is not. Neither condition disturbs coherence. There is a gentle continuity now, extending through moments without segmentation. You do not feel pulled into the next instant or held back by the last. Time flows without commentary. The timeline is no longer something you move along. It is something you are inside, evenly. Any remaining impulse to conclude, to summarize, to define what this was, may pass through briefly. That impulse comes from habit, not necessity. Let it pass. Definitions would only compress what is now spacious. Nothing here benefits from being finalized. You may notice that your breathing has found its own depth, not deeper, not slower, simply unmonitored. The body knows how to regulate itself when not observed too closely. This unobserved regulation is efficient. It does not perform. It functions. There is also a sense that you are less concerned with holding on to clarity. Clarity no longer feels fragile. It does not require protection. When clarity is structural rather than conceptual, it persists through distraction and returns after interruption without effort. The system is no longer orienting toward improvement. Improvement implies a future correction. What is present now does not need correction. It will adjust when conditions shift, as all systems do, but without framing that adjustment as progress or decline. It will simply respond. You do not need to stay in stillness for this to remain true. Movement will not break it. Engagement will not dilute it. This coherence is not dependent on environment or behavior. It is a baseline that travels with you without needing attention. Notice how there is no closing feeling here, no sense of completion or ending. That absence is accurate. Nothing has been opened that needs to be closed. Nothing has been activated that needs to wind down. What remains is what was already functioning beneath effort. You are not being asked to remember this later. Memory is optional. Recognition has already occurred at the level where memory is unnecessary. The system knows itself again, quietly, without declaration. Remain as you are, not because you should, but because there is no pressure to be otherwise. The field is stable. Awareness is sufficient. Nothing more is required.